Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of a Modern Nonprofit podcast. Today, I have a special friend here with me, Julio Barreto, and we're going to talk a little bit more about nonprofits and how we might think more like a for-profit and why that may or may not make sense for you. I, as you all know, run a for-profit business that works exclusively with nonprofits. So I'm on a little bit different perspective, and I used to work for a nonprofit. So I kind of get some of the challenges there with respect to that. And Julio, you too, you work with, for-profit, you've worked with nonprofit, you kind of mentor all sorts of people. So I'm really excited to get into this conversation and talk about, I think, some areas that could be maybe a little controversial, right? Because some people
Sure.
like to be very separate from the for-profit world. So let's just go ahead and dive right in. But thanks, Julio, for being with us today.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Good. So one of the questions that you and I were kind of talking about, it's sometimes said that nonprofits should learn to operate more like a for-profit entity, right? To create greater efficiency, not so much in the way of make profit, but to do things kind of smarter and not harder. What
Right.
can nonprofit executives learn from the private sector in your experience?
I think there are three things. I think one is really focusing on results. It's been my experience
Mhm.
that nonprofits oftentimes are so focused on process that they don't necessarily focus on getting results done. I think
Mhm.
second is not to be afraid to change and to be innovative. I worked with a nonprofit. The last nonprofit I worked with, I was there 13 years. 3 years in, it was obvious to me the structure they had in place was outdated and was
Mm.
not going to accommodate where the future was heading, where you can see where the future was going. So I think being willing to pivot when things aren't working, I think is important. And I think the third thing is to recognize that the nonprofit has assets that it can leverage for its
Mhm.
benefits. I'll give you two examples. That same organization I work with, we had a consultant approach us to help us with our fundraising. And they said, listen, you represent your members are active in a variety of sectors, IT, in
Mhm.
financial areas, construction. Those are
Mhm.
assets that we can leverage and get these companies to pay to basically access your membership. The
Mhm.
organization didn't understand that concept and
Mhm.
lost a golden opportunity in some cases to triple their fundraising revenue. The
Mhm.
second thing is we had a for-profit entity come to us and say, listen, we think you're sitting on a $20 million market and we want to provide management services to this market. We'll give you $800,000 in order for us to access that $20 million market. Now, the
Mm.
gentleman on staff that they approached thought that was a great deal. Me and others said, listen, if we're sitting on $20 million, why would we settle for 800,000?
Sure.
Why not reorganize ourselves
Mhm.
and go after the 20 million instead of settle for
Mhm.
the 800? He couldn't understand that
Mhm.
because he was of the mindset, let them do all the work and we can't repivot what we're doing. And so consequently, that opportunity fell by the wayside, all
Mm.
because we had leadership that didn't understand the importance of pivoting, but also recognize leveraging the assets that we had as an organization.
And what I'm hearing uh, a lot about what you're saying is this entrepreneurial kind of a hustle mindset on seize opportunities, make the short-term investments for long-time rewards. I see that a lot in business, especially in the
Right.
nonprofit space. I mean, I know because I've been doing the accounting, and those processes are usually so incredibly outdated.
That's right.
And what I've found is that sometimes there's a that you need to make some changes, you don't know where to go, or it just continues to fall further and further and further down the priority list,
That's right.
not realizing that you're giving up a lot of time and efficiency in the short run, simply because you just don't have the bandwidth to fix it. And so I will say, as a for profit business owner myself, that's not unique to the nonprofit world, right? I started a firm from scratch, and I did all of the things. I never worked
Right.
harder than I did for myself, even
Right.
even for a nonprofit, right? Which
That's
is
right.
kind of
That's right.
crazy
That's
because
right.
I was burned out in that job and I left, and I still had to force myself to re-engineer these processes, find efficiencies. Like
Right.
I still did it. It was still hard. I still felt like I didn't have the bandwidth. But we have to kind of keep so many of these things, constantly asking ourselves, how can we do it differently? How can we do it differently? So,
And I think the nature of the entities forces you to ask that question as an entrepreneur. And
right.
simply having an entrepreneur mindset doesn't mean that you have to be in a for-profit arena.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
I think even when people are looking to hire people, they tend to miss that point.
Yeah. I find the clients I love working with the most are very entrepreneurial minded in the nonprofit
Right.
space, and they're wanting
That's
to
right.
do things very unique. And it's going to be interesting to see how leadership styles shift,
Right.
as the world is constantly and rapidly evolving.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So, speaking of people that work in the nonprofit space, so people in this space tend to do so out of sense of duty or service, right? And sometimes there's this kind of concept of martyrdom, like in the nonprofit space.
Sure. Sure.
How can leaders create a work environment which capitalizes on the sense of duty without taking advantage of staff or self, frankly?
I think this is a really sensitive but an important area. I think number one, leaders need to be passionate about what they're doing themselves, and they need to be able to project that to their staff. I
Mhm.
think they also need to be actually very inclusive in how they hire staff. I think the more that people feel that they are part of something bigger than themselves, the more apt they are, one, to want to work for you and to continue that kind of passion. I think the other is, I think it's important to understand and be very people oriented. I think you need to understand and be sensitive to the fact that sometimes people need a pat on the back. Sometimes people need to recognize they don't go into a nonprofit to make money. They don't go into for the purpose of
No.
enriching themselves. And I
Mhm.
think that and sometimes in the nonprofit world, because of that, their self-worth can take a beating, and
Mhm.
constantly being reinforced that they're doing a great job, that you recognize the little things that they do, that it's important that they constantly get that constant reinforcement. But again, you have to be the kind of person that values people, that values the contribution that they make to your organization, and communicate that in an effective way, both publicly as well as privately.
Yeah, I love that. One of the takeaways that I had when I've, managed people, now I manage many people, but I started in public accounting, and there was always this kind of, it's a very cutthroat, very competitive environment. And really there's not a whole lot of pats on the back because it's just
Right.
expected, right? And I think sometimes people think that's a generational thing. Oh, these younger kids, they just want constant pats on the back. It's like, well, it's probably true. However, what I've realized in my experience is people just want to know where they stand, because I think overwhelming majority of people want to actually be successful, want to actually do well in their job, and they don't always know if they're performing within expectations or not. And so that constant feedback, constructive feedback, not always positive, not an attaboy all the time, but just an ongoing conversation about performance and expectations and responsibilities goes a really long way with all people I've found, not just that I've not found it to be a generation specific thing. I think people are not necessarily used to that, but people appreciate it once they start getting that ongoing communication dialogue, like you were saying.
I've learned two things about people. One is we're really children in adult bodies. And
Yes.
second, when you're managing more than 5 people, you're really managing an adult daycare center. And people constantly, as you say, people have that need. And sometimes the older the person is, the more important it is to give them some feedback and some recognition, because it's easy
Mm,
as you get older to, one, maybe just slide into retirement, or two, feel as if you're underappreciated for the new shiny thing. And we
mm,
all need a pat on the back, no matter
yeah.
who you are, from the president of the United States to the street sweeper. We all need a pat on the back saying "attaboy," and then move on.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I had a woman that reported under me, and she was twice my age, and I was a very young executive at the time. I think I was 28 when I took on my first CFO job, and and I had a very ongoing conversation every month. We're going to talk about performance and goals and deadlines and all the things and where are we at. And she had shared with me, I've never had a boss show more interest in my personal and professional development than you have. And I've been in the career field a lot longer than you have. And so that's what I mean by it's not just a generational thing. You're absolutely
That's
right.
right.
All people need that. So when they don't get that, usually I find that leads to burnout. You're coming along, you're doing the best that you can, you're not getting feedback positively or negatively, you're just spinning around not knowing what direction you're headed to or heading into. And I think that leads to burnout. So how do you think people can combat burnout in this space with respect to all of these challenges they're juggling?
I think one, it goes back to who you are as an individual. I think that uh, I've learned for myself, and I think others in the field, that those who see the job that they have as just one step in the continuum of their life, as opposed to their value wrapped around the work that they're doing, tend to have a healthier perspective on the environment that they're in. And they know when their time comes, when either maybe they're frustrated, it's irritated, it doesn't challenge them any longer. Um, their income necessarily isn't tied to, or their lifestyle isn't necessarily tied to the income that they're earning. By that I mean, they don't feel that they need to stay there because of the pay, if you will, regardless of what that level of pay is. I think the more you have a broader perspective of your life, I think the easier it is to identify burnouts. For me, I realized I spent a lot of time in the political arena, and I realized that as my personal faith increased, my tolerance for the day-to-day of politics decreased. And there was one instance where I realized I was done, and it all had to do with other people's egos needing to be validated to get something done. And it took us 6 months for their egos to be stroked to get to the point where we were at that one point in time. And we just wasted 6 months of time. And then I realized this is not for me any longer. So I think that, again, I think that the more you're in tune with who you are, I think, and you have people around you who you talk to, mentors, confidants, people who can give you the straight talk, who'll say, you know what, I think you need to take a step back. I think that you're maybe going a little bit off track here. I think all those things, I think, help counter burnout. But again, I think it also goes back to how you value people and how you recognize the individuals on your staff so that they don't burn out simply from you being the cause of the burnout. The failure to recognize them, the failure to give them something that's challenging. And in some cases, the failure really to kind of pay them enough to at least make it worth their while to stay where they are.
I love that you talked about ego. And I think in my experience, and this is a little controversial topic, in the nonprofit world that I've spent a lot of my time in, I see a lot of egos, a lot of martyrdom, a lot of ineffective communication, right? And we don't want to just sit down and have the conversation and deal with the conflict and talk it out, which is always really fascinating to me. Because I'm working in a population space of people that are trained in these things in a professional sense. But when it's in a personal conflict way, and you hear this kind of things all the time in nonprofit administration, finance department versus the fundraising department, the administration versus the program side. And it's no secret, there's a lot of this conflict across the aisles. You're talking in a political sense, but I see a lot different agendas with individual egos. And I think that leads to a large level of burnout as well, at least based on the people that I've noticed leave the sector for some of these political reasons. So I love that when you said you got burnout based on ego.
And let me just say one thing. The first job I had was doing civil rights work. And my boss was very out of the box when it came to those issues. He said, listen, if we do our job correctly, there shouldn't be a need for a civil rights organization. And he got attacked from every angle because his view was there should be an end in mind. We should have a goal that ends what we do. But that was something that people egos wouldn't allow it. And in this case, you had a lot of people who were products of the 60s, who were now in the administrative roles. They had positions of authority. They could not let go of the idea that they would no longer be needed.
Mm.
Your egos
Their
couldn't
identity.
handle it.
It's their identity,
Their
right?
identity was wrapped around it. And you got to be
Mm.
very careful about that. That's why you need to have, I think, an idea of where your life is going and how what you're doing fits into your overall life.
Oh, I love. So, kind of along those same lines, let's talk about kind of leadership style and when you're in a leadership role, and kind of what training and skills that you might be able to get or evolve from or develop in some way to make you an effective leader, checking the ego, thinking about the end result in mind, tracking or moving towards results and not necessarily just like processes or complacency, really.
Yeah. I think that I think the biggest thing is really developing your people skills. Life
Mm-hmm.
really is a series of personal interactions.
Mm.
And we learn how to communicate first from our parents, and then from our friends and family kind of grows out from there. But I think everybody has a different leadership style. You have to figure out what works for you. I work better under strong leadership.
Mm-hmm.
I have a hard time with people who I don't believe are strong leaders. And strong
Mm-hmm.
leaders to me are people who have conviction, people who are not afraid to express their opinion. They're not afraid. They accept the consequences of their actions. Weak leaders are always looking for the easy way out. The strong leaders are not looking for the easy. So I respond to strong leadership. I'm a New Yorker. Just tell me straight. I kind of joke, throw a couple of cuss words in there to make me feel at home. That's okay, right?
Yes.
And so I think you need to identify what kind of leadership that you're attracted to, but also and kind of develop those sort of skill sets. But you also have to be sensitive enough to understand not everybody might be attracted to your form of leadership.
Sure.
But the number one thing is you have to develop people skills. I once heard a gentleman who extremely successful businessman. I mean, when I say extremely successful, hundreds of millions of dollars.
Mm-hmm.
He says every quarter he reads How to Win Friends and Influence People.
Mm-hmm.
I said, if that's good enough for you, it's good enough for me. And
Right.
sometimes we poo-poo those 5 love languages, Mindset by Carol Dweck. I think that I think one of the reasons why I think I've been fairly successful is that I've been able to develop those people skills by reading those kind of books.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't realize how effective they are until you realize how effective they are.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And the better equipped you are as a people person, your ability to communicate with people, you will be an effective leader. And people will gravitate to you. They'll want to work for you and with you to get things done.
I love that. Somebody said to me one time in public accounting, because you get, ranked and, evaluated regularly by job.
Right.
And then it kind of supposedly leads up to your performance evaluation, all that kind of stuff. And somebody once said to me, it was a manager at the time, and he said, Tosha, it's not how good you are, technically speaking. It's how much people like you. And I think when I repeat that, and that stuck with me since then, I mean, this is 15 years now. And that really stuck with me because I think people hear that and they think, well, you have to be a chameleon. You have to be fake. You have to, just be whoever you want people to be. But really, I think it's more along the lines of what you're describing. It's a constant intention to build personal connections and relationships. There's some sort of relatability with people so that they will want to work with you. They want to, interact with you. They respect you or something else. But I think that is really the key, I think, to the success that I've had is understanding that I have to be likable. It doesn't mean you always have to agree with me, but we have to be able to have conversations. You have to be able to trust my integrity, all of the things that are going to make someone likable, right? And I love that.
And you have to understand that you can't control how people react to you. You can only control how you handle yourself. And ultimately, people will respect you for that. And at the end of the day, that's all that matters.
That reminds me of another book, The 4 Agreements. Have you read that one?
No, I haven't.
Oh, you should. It's a quick read, but it talks a lot about that, about, you cannot own how other people respond to you. That's them, not you. So I love that. I want to throw in one other thing that, to really nail, and because I enjoyed the conversation so much around the ego. And I think where also going back to how it relates to nonprofits that I have seen is that compared to, for example, how I run my business, right?
Mhm.
I have a concern that in the event that Tosha failed to show up one day, how long would this business continue
Sure.
until it fizzled out to nothing, right? Because it's the Tosha Anderson show. And I really realized how vulnerable that is for my clients, for my staff, for my family, right? And so about a year and a half ago, I started a relentless pursuit of making myself as irrelevant in my business as possible for the betterment of the clients, the employees, and my family, right? That would have to survive on beyond me or my abilities to work. And since then, I've been very intentional to make sure there's a succession plan for every key function within the business. And oftentimes, I've noticed in the nonprofit space that we have very siloed departments.
That's right.
There's usually one person that operates in that function, fundraising, a finance person, maybe a program director, and then there's like the ED or the CEO. And there might be a few other roles, but by and large, there's very distinct silos, and nobody really knows how the other department does things. And nobody really has a transition plan or a succession plan, short or long term, for those key roles. And really, in my experience, I've seen where organizations will keep leaders in place. And I've actually witnessed this happening, that we had a poor leader in place way longer than they should have been because no one knew
Right.
how to do some of the key functions of that job. That was the only reason. And so I think for-profit businesses figure out, how can I make money without me having to show up to work every day? How can I make money, make sure that I'm growing the business and it's not me doing all of the work, right? How can I drop my ego, which was a bit of an ego blow for me, I have to confess,
Sure.
that,
Sure.
hey,
Sure.
this is no longer going to be the Tosha show. It's got to be a firm, and it's got to be all of us. And really, like I said, almost aggressively pursuing a transition plan for every single key function. And now some days people ask me, Tosha, what are you going to do? And I said, I don't know. I'll figure something out, but
Right.
it's
Right.
not
Right.
going to be, it can't be me. And as hard as that is to accept, and I especially feel that's true with founders of nonprofits.
Right.
And I had a
That's right.
conversation with the founder
That's
last week, and I basically told them, this is not your story anymore. Based on all the people you've impacted, it's a collection of stories, and it can't be about you anymore. And I think that was a huge wake up call for him, but I think he appreciated that. So,
Yeah.
so I would
Two
say
things, if
drop
you
the
don't.
ego too. Mhm.
Yeah, two things if you don't mind. I think there are 2
Absolutely.
points that you raised. One is when it comes to leadership, what people tend to do is they're so insecure about somebody taking their position that they tend to hire somebody who doesn't threaten them as opposed to someone who is
Mm,
really qualified and strong for the position. And that person
mhm,
does the same thing. So you have insecurity in the chain of leadership. So you got to get away
mm,
from that. The second thing, to
yes.
your point about legacy, I think there are 3 questions that leaders need to ask themselves. One is what kind of life you want to live.
Mhm,
2 is what kind of legacy you want to leave behind. And 3,
mhm,
what are you doing intentionally every day to fulfill the answers to those first 2 questions? And if people have a hard time understanding what they want their legacy to be, do this exercise of write their obituary.
mhm.
And if you write your obituary, ask yourself, are you living? Is that simply a public statement, or is that really a standard that your family is to live by moving forward?
Mhm. I love that. What a great conversation, Julio. And
Thank you.
I'd love to know a little bit more. You had mentioned some of the ways that you've kind of developed, in your journey along to getting to this point where we're having this conversation. And it sounds like you have quite a bit of wisdom in the leadership space. So tell us,
I
how did you end
appreciate
up
that.
here? How did you, how did you
Well,
end up here? I always like to ask that question. It's always an interesting story.
I'm not going to say that it was planned. I'm just a kid from the Bronx. Really, a kid from the Bronx has been blessed. I was never the top student in class. They say consistency is the key to success. I was consistently a C student, and I'm very proud of that consistency. Have a social work degree, grad and undergrad, although I've never had a social work job. As I was completing my master's in social work, I couldn't figure out what social workers did. And then just decided I
Mm,
wanted to be a writer. And that led to an internship in Washington, D.C., a journalism internship. And that led to, during the course of an interview with a Hispanic civil rights advocate, he offered me a job as one of his legislative aides, and that started a 25-year career in politics. And to put it in perspective, I just turned 32 for the second time, so to age myself a little bit. The last time the country passed an immigration bill, he helped to write half that bill. So I got access to some high-level politics at an early age, at an early stage in my career, represented local governments, mayor, city council people, and then represented housing officials. Had some medical issues as well that caused me to sort of leave the full-time job space, and that forced me to be an entrepreneur. And I'm still in a position where I'm able to make money, but also be of service to the community as well. So it's a great place to be.
I love that. And if people want to follow you, whether it's on social media or websites or anything, what's the best way for people to follow along with
really, the best way to reach me is either by phone or by email. If you don't mind me giving my phone number, it's 240-381-6311 or jbj1153@gmail.com. I can be found on Facebook. I can be found on LinkedIn. But I just appreciate the opportunity to be here.
I love that. Well, thank you so much. And it's been great. So I'm sure we'll be hearing from you again soon. I really enjoyed this conversation. And like I said, thanks again for joining us.
Take care. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.